have a couple of weeks. We will have some weeks to go over it, but it is complex. It is complex, but you're used to complex, right? You've managed to survive thus far. Thus far, you've managed to survive. Okay? So, today, we're actually going to go over a bit of a review, starting into chapter 8, because if you started reading chapter 8, you should know that it reviews you for a reason, so that you can start adding to the layers of knowledge, the comprehension of what's been happening all along to where we're going and creating the image. Okay? So, any questions before we get started? Everyone get the PowerPoint that I sent you today. Okay, so again, we're going to review. We're going to review for the majority of today, we're going to review a bit of chapter 7 and a little bit beyond that, okay? Any questions? So, image production and evaluation. This is going to be very complex, like I said, because we're going to introduce digital. In this chapter, we're going to introduce it's basically going to be what happens with the primary beam, how it interacts with matter, and then the image receptor receives it and calculates what we see. Okay? So this is about image production. So we're going to get very, very heavy into the image receptor, especially digital, towards the latter part of this chapter. So the objectives are outlined in your book. They didn't give them in the PowerPoint, but however, we will be going over the process of radiographic formation, explain the process of beam attenuation. Attenuation, there's that word. I love that word, by the way. I love that word. Identify the factors that affect a beam attenuation. What factors could those be? Describe the X-ray interactions termed, we know photoelectric effect, and we know Compton effect. What is ionization? We all know that word. We all know what ionization means, and state the composition. And it continues on to be a little bit more in detail, especially when we start talking about matrix. Matrix, this is digital imaging. If you hear the word matrix, you're going to be hearing or talking about digital imaging. Got it? So matrix, pixel size, define the pixel bit depth. A lot is coming your way. So please, please, please stay on top of your material. Okay. So what do we have here? What's happening up here? Someone.
Catching a baseball.
Okay, so we know what sport this is, right, Asbedi?
It's baseball.
It's baseball, right? So we see the ball, and it's about to make its way on into the catcher's glove, right? What's the point am I trying to make? It would be difficult to catch this ball without this glove, right? And in the rules of baseball, does the ball have to be in the glove when someone is going to be called out? Anyway.
Yes.
Yes. So these have to connect, right? So where am I going with this? I want you to think of this baseball as a photon and this glove as an image receptor. So when we talk about photons, we know that we're talking about X-rays that are being created inside of the X-ray tube, either through Bremsstrahlung or characteristic. They exit the tube through total filtration, which we already know is what? Somebody besides Asbedi. Okay, voluntold. Aurora. What is total filtration? What is that amount?
Is it the 1/3? No, that's losing the.
Talking about total filtration. How much of the beam has to pass through all of this filtration in order for it to be deemed safe?
2.5
Millimeters
millimeters.
of aluminum.
Yes.
Of aluminum. Perfect. So we have thank you. So these photons must pass through 2.5 millimeters of aluminum as it exits out of the tube. We know the symbol for photons, correct? You guys are writing, and I want you to be listening. This all information is in your book. The image receptor is the device that is going to capture. But we know that the primary beam has many photons and at different energy levels. What is the average energy level, Isaias, of the primary beam at 100 kVp?
Going to be 100.
That is not I'm talking the average of all of these photons at my highest energy
70.
at 100. It is going to be 1/3. It is going to be approximately 33 keV. 33 keV. It is 1/3 of the highest energy that I can set, and that is my kVp. So we know, and we learned in this last chapter, the primary beam is going to interact with the tissue, John. And in our diagnostic range, there are two types of interactions that are significant in producing an image. What are they?
Photoelectric. Compton.
In Compton. So we know as the primary beam enters the patient, and we know that around this area, Duan, what is my primary beam going to interact with? What kind of tissue?
Is that the webcam tissue?
What kind of tissue? What is my beam? What is this aiming at? Low thorax, high abdomen. What am I going to encounter? What is this primary beam going to bump into? What organs? What anatomy?
Right there, I guess the lung or the liver.
Lungs is one. Good. Thank you, Duan. Jessley, give me another one.
Ribs.
Like the heart?
Heart, veins.
Okay, good. I like it. Jaleisha, give me another one.
Ribs, the veins.
Ribs, vessels, beautiful. What else? Javier is sitting right over here in his right upper quadrant.
Let's say the spine. But
Right upper quadrant.
where were you pointing? I didn't see where you were pointing.
The right upper quadrant of
the liver.
Beautiful. So what's my point? All of these different tissues are going to have a different reaction with the average energy of the primary beam. And then what happens, Jolie, once the beam enters the patient, has these interactions, what do we call this beam? What do we call this beam?
So it's I know it's absorption, but
It's exit, and it's also remnant. So this beam is going to be different than this one, and we're going to talk about it. So the exit, you can forget about ionization chamber. I just wanted the picture. We'll talk about those later. All right, so when we're looking at beam quantity, Jonan, versus beam quality, this should have came in later, but I don't want to get you distracted. Let me go right here. What is beam quantity versus beam quality? So what is beam quantity, Jonan?
The amount of photons in the primary beam?
Just the amount. The sheer amount of photons in the beam. What controls it, Jonan?
Mass.
mass, MA, and time. Perfect. Beam quality, Wani, help me. What is beam quality?
It's controlled by KVP.
It does
Quality.
control by KVP.
What else?
Okay, Sharon? Help her out, Sharon.
Is the penetration power.
It is the penetration power. It is the ability to get to the image receptor. It is the ability to get to the finish line. The finish line is the image receptor. Okay? So why do I have these soldiers here? When you take a look at these gentlemen, they look like they're quite prepared for the long haul, aren't they? They look like they are going to get to the final outcome. When you talk about all of these soldiers, and I'm using it for Veterans Day, if I'm talking about all of these soldiers, we can see that there is a large number. We can count. And not to talk about their ability, but there's just sheer numbers. So when you take beam quantity, the amount of photons, regardless of their energy level, because remember, KVP is going to set the highest, and not all photons will carry the highest energy. Most of the photons will carry about 1/3 of what is set. Only a few KVP will be able or have that high penetrating power to meet that image receptor. So I'm going to stop there, and I want to get questions. I want to make sure at this point in the game, we understand what is beam quantity versus beam quality, because we are going to start adding to those. No questions? Everyone understands that beam quality is about the penetrating power of the primary beam. It is controlled by KVP. The higher the KeV of the photon, the more likely it is going to reach the image receptor. The higher the KeV or the quality, the likelier it is going to reach the image receptor. So everyone understands. I can leave this alone. Right? Okay. All right, so photons. We know that they're going to interact with the body. And we know that there's various tissues in the body. We're not all created of feathers. We're not all created of bone. We're all not consistent of the same amount of muscle. We're not all consistent of the same amount of adipose. We're not all consistently the same. Okay? So nervous tissue will have a different reaction of photon interaction than connective tissue will. Photons will interact differently with skeletal muscles versus epithelial. Photons will interact differently with cardiac muscle versus smooth muscle. It depends on how dense the tissue is. What does tissue density mean, Amy?
It's the amount of thickness of that body structure.
What if I had a lot of adipose? Is that dense? What does... Okay, so what does dense mean? When you think about it,
How tightly compacted it is.
it's highly compacted. If I were to take adipose, no matter how thick it is, and compress it. I have compacted that tissue more, making it more difficult for photons to pass through. So tissue density is not thickness. It is how compact the cells are close to each other. Make sure you write that down, because I always get thickness for tissue density, and it is not. It is how compact the tissues are. Tissue density means how compact the tissues are with each other. Not thickness, compact. So we have osteocytes or bone cells that are highly compact. They are next to each other and they are squished. Reason why photoelectric absorption is more likely to happen around bone. Air has space in between the cells, or molecules, not cells, the molecules, right? So x-rays are easier to pass through without interactions. So now we're incorporating the human body. We are now incorporating the human body. We are now going to add various tissue densities, various thickness into the mix. So when we look at it, tissue composition such as thickness, atomic number. What does atomic number mean again, Daniel?
Is that the amount of atoms in a cell?
Electrons and protons. Good job. So the amount of electrons and protons in an atom. So the higher the atomic number, the more compact, the less likely a photon is likely going to pass through that atom without some type of interaction. Good, perfect. So atomic number, thickness of tissue, and tissue density, how compact the cellular structures are. Tissue density does not mean thickness. Thickness does not mean atomic number. Make sense? Does everyone understand what I'm saying? Perfect. So let's take an example here. So we know, okay, first of all, so we have nervous tissue, muscle tissue, connective tissue, which is in the bone, and then we have epithelial. We know that x-rays are going to interact differently. And connective tissue or bone tissue are likely to probably more experience Compton interactions or photoelectric interactions. I'm sorry, let me call on someone. Luke. Are we likely to have more photoelectric absorption or Compton scattering in the bone? I can't hear you, Luke. Luke, unmute for me.
Is it Compton?
Okay, think about it. If you have...
Oh, wait, no, photoelectric.
There you go. It's likely going to deposit all of its energy, right? So now I want to give you an example because we're looking at a diagram and she looks to be pretty average, right? We know that we have different types of tissues. We're composed of different types of tissue. But at any given point, this can change, can't it? Yes, Miss Laura, it can. How? Well, let me show you an example, because what we would do for the average size patient is where we like to stay and keep our minds at, the average. But that's not reality. That's not reality. We can look around us, we can look in the mirror, we can look wherever we want, and we're going to see not so average people. So let's take this example here. We have two different types of distinct tissue. Yes, we have organs. Yes, he still has a brain. Yes, he still has a skeleton. Yes, he still has his intestines. But what is obviously different here, Miss Jessley?
Well, one's bigger than the other, like the body tissue.
Same guy.
It is?
Yeah, it's the same guy.
Oh.
Look at the face. Yes.
Oh, I thought it was totally different.
No.
With
So,
the body habituous, though.
the what?
The body habituous.
The body habitus is different.
Yes.
Well, no, the body habitus is the structure of the skeleton.
Mm-hmm.
Adipose, a collection or added adipose or soft tissue, is going to behave, photons are going to behave differently with excess adipose. But adipose is soft tissue. It's soft tissue, right? But here, he has transformed himself, one or the other, when one is an after and one is a before, with more compact tissue, where we went from soft tissue to compact tissue because it is now more muscle. So when we take this example and we say, well, okay, how will the X-rays interact differently with these two body types? Which one could we expect that the photons would travel, would have a less ease of passing through? And the answer is both. Why would I say both? Who has that rationale for me? Why would I say both?
One is thick, one is dense.
One is thick, thank you, Naomi, and one is dense. Thickness went up, density went up. Make sense? So when you start to add thickness, that's more layers for photons to go through. When you add more dense, then that's more difficult for photons to go through. Questions? Because this is where we're going to be focusing for the first part of the chapter. Not on him, but the concepts. Thickness, tissue density, and atomic numbers. Everyone's good? Ooh, oh, man. What happened here, Betty? Let's take a look at this x-ray. What has happened here?
Seems like it got stabbed.
What did he get stabbed with?
It looks like not a knife, but like a hook.
A hook, right?
Like that's what it looks.
Is it metal?
It is metal, based on the color.
Metal. Why do we say, and so doing, I see, you know what, I love these images because people get revived and they're like, what is that? That's awesome. I can now see that. Why do we know that that's metal?
Color is like what I call the radio opaque. So like when the metal is like you can see like it's so bright on the X-ray image.
Melted my heart, doing. You melted my heart. Thank you very much. It has brightness, and we know that when X-rays get absorbed into the body or the hook, it is not going to be able to pass onto the image receptor. And so therefore, an outline of the item that blocked those photons is left as a high brightness. So the outline of the hook is here. Make sense? Because the X-rays that were passing through on this part of the primary tube were now absorbed. So we have an outline. That's why we're able to see or note what type of atomic number it was because of its extreme high brightness. Here, we're able to see what? What is this, Betty? It has a dark appearance.
That's what I was looking at. I'm not sure. Just air?
Is it the esophagus?
What? Good. I like the esophagus. esophagus. It starts with the nasopharynx, the pharynx, and here we go straight into the trachea, right here. So we know air is going to travel down a pipe, right? Pharynx and then into the larynx, and then here we have the trachea. Good. So we're able to determine, because of outlines of X-ray interactions with the body, what items, what anatomy is present. Easy to do with the very dark radiolucent areas versus the bright radiopaque. Everything else in between has to have some different types of interactions, right? Good. So, yes, it's a hook. Looks like it made its way into the person's right eye, right? And they'll have to go back. And yes, they have a zipper and some leads, and they are seeking some type of medical intervention, right? So on and so forth. Does anybody have any questions about how X-rays interact with radiopaque or radiolucent items? Radiolucent air, radiopaque, either metal or bone. Good. Okay. All right. So, what is happening here? We have a thorax. We have a thorax A and we have a thorax B. This is a phantom, by the way, so I don't want you to think anyone is missing a head or missing any intestines. This is a phantom. So nonetheless, we have some dark areas, which we know, just from normal everyday viewing, since you started the program, we have looked at chest x-rays. Now, this is the same phantom. This is the same phantom. But we can see that one phantom, phantom A, has a darker appearance in the lung area than in phantom B. Can anyone explain that rationale to me? Same phantom. What changed?
Did they increase the KVP and made it X-ray?
They increased a technical factor, right? Which one, A or B, as Betty has more transmission?
KVP.
Which one, A or B, has more transmission?
B.
More transmission?
No, A.
Very good. More transmission is going to give me dark, isn't it? More transmission is going to give me dark. Less transmission or more absorption is going to give me bright. Okay? We're going to get into what is differential absorption and review that. Does anyone have any questions? The anatomy stayed the same, but now we manipulated our primary beam. Make sense? Yes? Okay.
Ms. Laura, I have a question. Going to the other image with the hook. Why is it blue? Is it because of the metal, or is just?
No, blue is because back in radiographs, this is more of a radiograph. A blue tint was added just so that you could have a little bit more visibility. So normally when you see radiographs now, they don't have that bluish tint, but this is more of an X-ray. So in X-rays, there was, because of the chemicals that were being used to develop, had a more of a bluish tint to it.
Thank you.
All right. So let's go back to differential absorption, because I love this word too, or these words, attenuation and differential absorption. So I have it in color. You do have this slide, and this says anatomic parts, which is our body, different parts, do not absorb the primary beam to the same degree. So let's take a look. Here we have our primary beam. This is our symbol for X-rays. As the primary beam is entering into the body, depending on what it's along its path, it may find its way to the image receptor. Depending on what it is along its path, it may be absorbed into the anatomy, or it may be deflected away from the image receptor, right? So we've talked about this interaction and we've talked about this interaction. We're eventually going to spend some time and talk about these two interactions. So depending on what's in the path, what's on the road, what's on the sidewalk, for this primary beam to achieve its destination, which is the image receptor, whatever it encounters, it may be absorbed. It may not be prohibited from reaching the image receptor at all, or it may become deflected. Scattered is the word. So differential absorption, we need it, creates the image because it represents the anatomic area, meaning the lack of photons reaching the image receptor right here will give us an outline of vertebrae. Make sense? Questions? So everyone understands the magic happens within the body at different degrees, right? Good. So what is attenuation? Attenuation, we defined this term on this last chapter because I need you to understand, I need you to be well informed, I need you to be ready to tell me, recite it, because I'm going to ask you, just like ionization. Ruth, what's the definition of ionization? You don't have to give me the official definition, but what would I say is the definition of ionization, Ruth?
Is the removal of the electron from its orbit.
From its orbit, good. So attenuation is going to be the reduction in energy. What does energy mean here, Aurora? When I say the energy of the primary beam, what am I talking about?
Is it like the power of how the photons are coming in?
Power, the penetrating power. Beautiful. So not only is attenuation the reduction of the power or energy of the primary beam, but it is also taking out the number of photons in the primary beam. So not only is it reducing the energy, but it is also reducing the number. So it would make equal sense to know the two types of interactions that we've already discussed in chapter 7, absorption and scattering, are forms of attenuation. So the reduction in the power or energy and the number, quantity, of the primary beam happens through absorption and scattering, photoelectric and Compton. But what is the definition of attenuation? It's the reduction in energy and number of photons in the primary X-ray beam. Attenuation reduces quality and quantity of the primary beam. I can say it so many different ways, but they all say the same thing. So when does attenuation happen? It only happens inside of matter. It only happens when we are, or the photons go through an object. So please, 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 I should have put about 1,000 stars on this slide. So imagine that there are about 1,000 stars on this slide. You need to remember what attenuation is because it's going to be with you from here until you complete the registry. Just like ionization. Any questions? Oh my God, no questions? I am doing so good. All right, so let's go back again. Beam attenuation. Beam attenuation. Well, we know that we're reducing the energy and the quantity of the beam. We know that this is the definition, the reduction in energy or number of photons. And you sit there and you say, well, okay, how so? reduction in energy, and the number of photons. Because if we take a look at this image again, how many primary photons went in? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We had 6 quantity photons in the primary beam. How many are in the remnant radiation beam? Or the remnant beam, to be simple.
2.
2. What happened to the other 4?
It was absorbed by the patient.
2 of them were absorbed inside of the patient through which interaction?
Photoelectric interaction?
Photoelectric. And then we had 2 that were deflected or angled or scattered under what type of interaction?
Compton.
Compton?
So was this beam attenuated? By definition,
Yes.
it is, because we lost a few through absorption and we lost a few through Compton, photoelectric and Compton. So the beam, a lot of people will say attenuate mean it goes through. No, it doesn't. Attenuate does not go through. Got it? Attenuate means either it was lost or reduced. The photons from the primary beam were either lost or reduced in energy. Because we know, and I'm going to go back to John. So here we have a Compton scattered photon. Let's pretend that it makes it to the image receptor. But how much is the value of this Compton photon as opposed to what it was in the primary beam?
It's 2/3.
How much?
It's 2/3. It loses a third of its energy.
Good. So it is reduced in the energy that it has, correct? Good. So fewer X-ray photons remain in the beam after it interacts with anatomic tissue.
Ms. Laura, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Just to clarify, in the book, when it was talking about the remnant beam, it said the remnant beam consisted of transmitted and scattered photons. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
It cannot be absorbed because absorbed got lost in the body. So what is basically is kind of goes back to the example that I gave you. What if this photon happened to reach the image receptor? Because we know that a photon that has been scattered can eventually reach the image receptor, will contribute no useful information, but will still deposit its 2/3 of energy that it originally had onto the image receptor. So if the photon that was deflected or scattered reaches the image receptor, then it becomes, or it leaves the patient, to be more accurate, leaves the patient and reaches the image receptor, it is considered remnant or exit radiation.
So if it scatters off into the opposite direction, it doesn't reach the IR.
If it does, no, then it just contributes to occupational health. Occupational dose.
Okay, so that's not considered remnant. Okay, gotcha.
No, the remnant radiation is specific to saying that exits the patient reaching the image receptor. I may not say it specifically in this resource, but you won't ever hear anything about radiation, remnant or exit defined anywhere else other than in front of the image receptor. Okay? So in your book, it goes back. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Because I think we did fairly well. Photoelectric talks about inner shell ejecting or ionization. We know what the inner shell name takes on once it's been ejected. We know that it takes on a different name. We know that the energy is lost. But the key word is it's an inner shell. Compton scattering, we know that the incident X-ray comes in and affects an outer shell. We know that there are some byproducts of that interaction. So both interactions have different byproducts, meaning different results, different aftermath occurrences. So I also want to make sure that we understand this when we get to next semester. And like I said, this is my very first time going through this resource. And I definitely have a different plan, knowing what I know now, to go over symbols a lot earlier. So this wave, we know it's a photon. And how many little waves that it has, it means it has a higher energy. When it starts to lose the amount of waves, we know that it's going to be of lower energy. So with that, we know that this picture is saying we came in at a certain energy and we have lost some of our energy, approximately 1/3 of it, right? We lost some of the energy and now we're moving on. Whether we make it, whether this Compton photon makes it to the image receptor, whether it leaves the patient and gets absorbed into the occupational worker, or whether it continues on to further cause any ionization, Compton scattering effects, it has that ability. Okay? So in your book, there is also comparing photoelectric Compton effects, photoelectric versus Compton. Okay? So please go through that. Make sure that we have a great understanding of what that means. Okay? Make sure that we understand photoelectric effect completely different from Compton effect. Okay? Why do we spend so much time on these two, Esaias?
Did you say?
Because, I'm sorry, I said, why do we spend so much time on photoelectric effect and Compton effect?
Because they are important for our image quality.
Beautiful. You said it so beautifully. Thank you very much. So when we get into scatter, we talked about coherent scatter, classical scatter, so on and so forth. Does not contribute anything to the image. Does not contribute to differential absorption. It just doesn't. Differential absorption is all about the image, whether you have photoelectric absorption, whether you have Compton scattering, and whether you have transmission. In order to make differential absorption happen, you need the three things that I just said. What did I just say, Amy? In order to make differential absorption, you need the three
my mind just went blank right now, but
okay, this one.
Do you mind?
The photoelectric effect, the Compton effect, or it has to.
What does this one say?
Transmission.
Thank you. You need those three.
Okay.
To make differential absorption. So when we think about coherent scattering, classical scattering, that is not part of differential absorption. That only happens at the very low end of our spectrum, and it only contributes to what? What does classical coherent scattering contribute to? Patient dose, and dose. So scattered photons, whether it's coherent, Thomson, classical, or Compton, do not contribute any useful information on the radiograph. That is a true statement. So scattered photons, whether they come from coherent, Thomson, classical, or Compton, do not contribute any useful information. They only contribute to the radiation exposure of the patient and others, Compton. So I will say this, and I'll let you copy this, because this is in your book, but I want you to have it. I have a big old brain and a lightning bolt. Tracy, what is secondary radiation? Tracy? Can you hear me, Tracy? What is secondary radiation?
Is it radiation referring to what's being absorbed?
That's a good thought. But you've seen the word secondary before. Where have you seen the word secondary before from the last chapter? Help her out, Pamela.
I'm sorry. Can you say where have you?
Secondary. Where have I seen the word secondary before?
Photoelectric interaction?
I can't hear you.
The photoelectric interaction?
Yes. So especially in the photoelectric absorption. So where do the secondary photons emerge from?
From the outer shell.
Beautiful. So secondary radiation just basically means secondary photons, correct? Yes. So scattered and secondary photon or secondary radiation from characteristic cascading provides no useful information on the radiograph, must be controlled during radiographic imaging. We have to learn how to control it because it does not contribute to quality imaging, but contributes to increased patient dose. Make sense? So we have to control scatter, and we will. We'll learn how to control scatter, and we will also learn how to control secondary photons. We've already learned one way on how to control scatter. If I want to minimize my scatter, what do I need to do to my KVP?
Decrease it?
Decrease.
Decrease. Good job. Decrease it. Decrease it. If I want to decrease scatter, I got to decrease my KVP. That could be easier said than done because if I decrease my KVP, my absorption goes up. So, image production, because this is our chapter. This is our chapter. This is our chapter. The radiation that exits the patient is composed of varying energies. So, the radiation that exits the patient, I'm going to go back to John N. What do we call this? The radiation that exits the patient.
Exit radiation or remnant radiation.
The remnant beam.
Remnant or exit. Okay, so remnant or exit. So we know in the remnant or exit beam, we have varying energies. Now, it was easier to determine the emission spectrum when we set this high KVP, right? We set this high KVP and we were able to see the brim X-rays versus the characteristic X-rays on an emission spectrum. It was easy to determine if we set this high KV, we could tell how many, plotting it on that. Remember the image spectrum graph where you had the Y's, the quantity, the X plane was going to be the energy. You guys remember that? You know what I'm talking about? Yes? What chapter was that in?
Two exams ago.
2 exams ago. Okay, I'll take it. 2 exams ago is Betty. So when we talked about emission spectrum, we talked about the X-rays in the primary beam. Well, what has now changed? We're talking about the energy levels in the remnant beam. What has changed there? Anyone? This is what I've been talking about for the last 50 minutes.
Are you talking about attenuation? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I am. So what does attenuation have to? So we're talking about the radiation exit. So we're talking about the remnant beam is composed of various energies of Y. We can't plot it on the emission spectrum because the emission spectrum was the primary beam. Now we're talking about the remnant beam. Why are we composed of varying energies? And John said it because of attenuation. Because of attenuation. Make sense? So attenuation has to do with what?
The rejection of energy.
Patient matter. So composed of varying energies, and it interacts with the image receptor. These photons in the remnant beam or exit beam is going to have its own interactions with the image receptor. But these two words right here, well, this one specifically, the photons in the remnant beam are going to interact with the image receptor to create the latent image. The latent image. It is the latent image, or better described as the invisible image on the screen before computer algorithms produce the brightness levels. High brightness, low brightness. High brightness, very, very bright. Low, 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 low bright. Very white, very black. High brightness, low brightness. So across where you have radio opaque leaves brightness, I want you to also put brightness goes in high and low. Low brightness, high brightness. Low brightness, high brightness. What do I mean by lowest of brightness? It means it's dark. It's not bright at all. It's the lowest. When we get to what is a matrix is going to identify and plot those brightness levels for us. So much more to come. I'm so excited. So excited. So, latent image is the invisible image that the remnant or exit radiation will.
We can't hear you, Flora.
Injury.